The Arctic wind howled like a phantom through the rigging of HMS Belfast, a banshee's wail that never seemed to cease. It tore across the decks with bone-chilling intensity, slamming into sailors who dared venture into its grasp. Each gust brought with it a barrage of frozen needles, flakes of snow and salt whipped into miniature blades by the gale, cutting into exposed skin and numbing fingers through thick gloves. The Royal Navy cruiser plowed forward through the pitch-black waters of the Barents Sea, her bow smashing through frigid swells that broke like glass on her armored hull, sending sheets of icy spray high into the air before they came crashing down again in waves that threatened to freeze solid before they hit the deck. December 1943. The world below the Arctic Circle was lit up with the chaos of global war, but here, above the 70th parallel, there was only darkness, bitter cold, and silence broken only by the groaning steel of the ship and the moaning wind. The sun had abandoned this part of the world weeks ago. Only a dull smudge of blue-gray twilight on the southern horizon gave any hint that day existed at all. For the men aboard Belfast, it might as well have been night forever. Every surface of the cruiser was rimmed with frost. The once shining brass and polished gun barrels now bore a coat of ice that grew thicker by the hour. Ropes hung stiff like frozen snakes. The canvas covers around the AA guns were rock hard, and even the steel railings radiated a malicious cold that bit through gloves and stuck to bare skin like hot metal in reverse. Sailors moved carefully and methodically, their boots crunching on layers of frozen slush, their breath rising in great clouds of steam that instantly condensed into frost on their scarves and collars. Conversations were short, functional, and often shouted over the din of the wind. Nobody wasted words in that environment. Energy had to be conserved. Warmth, such as it was, came from within and from routine. Below decks, warmth came only in fits. The boilers and machinery spaces offered a reprieve from the cold, but even there the steel bulkheads radiated a ghostly chill. In the mess, men huddled over tin mugs of black tea or watery cocoa, fingers trembling as they held the steaming metal. The usual camaraderie of the Royal Navy had not disappeared. It was still there in glances, in murmured jokes, in shared cigarettes, but it was muted by the oppressive Arctic silence and the knowledge that death could come swiftly, not only from the cold, but from torpedoes or Luftwaffe bombers at any hour. HMS Belfast was no stranger to this brutal environment. She had been built for war and strengthened for the ice, her hull reinforced, her systems adapted to Arctic convoys, but that didn't make the task easier. She was part of the escort for Convoy JW 55B, a lifeline of supply ships braving the northern route to deliver precious equipment, ammunition, and food to the Soviet Union. In return, the Soviets were holding the Eastern Front against Hitler's armies. The stakes were enormous. The enemy knew it. The Kriegsmarine's shadow loomed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps lurking behind a fjord or drifting silently below the waves, the German battleship Scharnhorst was prowling. The British had been tracking her movements, piecing together radio intercepts, air reconnaissance, and signals intelligence. They knew she might be close. They knew she was hunting the convoy. And so Belfast and the rest of the escort force, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels were tense, alert, and braced for action. On the bridge, officers stood wrapped in thick greatcoats, their breath misting in the air, eyes fixed on radar screens and black churning waters beyond. Orders were given in clipped tones. Lookouts scanned the dark with binoculars, eyes watering from the wind. Below in the gun turrets, crews worked in near silence, hands red and cracked as they checked breeches and loaded shells, waiting for the word to fire. The great 6-inch guns sat ready, cold and ominous against the frozen sky. It was war in its most elemental form, stripped of glamour, heroics, or spectacle, just cold steel, colder weather, and the constant awareness that somewhere out there the enemy might already have a firing solution. And yet, the sailors carried on. Each man had his task. Each task was part of a chain, and the chain kept the ship moving, the guns loaded, the radar spinning, the engines rumbling forward into the unknown. There was no music on the loudspeakers, no cheer of carols for Christmas, no lights strung across the decks, just the ceaseless rumble of the engines, the metallic creak of the hull under stress, and the wind, always the wind, howling like a vengeful ghost through the spars and rigging. It found every gap in every collar, clawed its way under hoods and balaclavas, whispered of frostbite and drowning and death by fire or ice. Yet still they went on. Every man on Belfast knew the risks. The Arctic convoys were some of the most dangerous missions of the war. In summer, there had been long days and the threat of the Luftwaffe. In winter, there was only this: darkness, snow, and German warships with teeth. But their purpose drove them. They weren't just ferrying goods, they were sustaining an ally. They were holding a line. They were daring the enemy to come out and fight. And somewhere out there, in the freezing mist and the long night, Scharnhorst was preparing to do just that. This was the Arctic convoy route, one of the most perilous, unforgiving stretches of ocean on Earth, transformed by war into a frozen artery of survival. It linked the icy ports of northern Britain with the Soviet harbors of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, threading its way through seas so cold they could kill a man in minutes, under skies that never saw sunlight in winter and seldom knew peace even in summer. Along this lifeline sailed the convoys, grim, dogged formations of merchant ships bearing the burdens of war and the hope of alliance. What they carried was no less than the material fuel of resistance. Tank hulls lashed to rusted decks, fighter planes with their wings folded and tarped, caged in crates. Drums of precious aviation fuel stacked like barrels of gold. Boxes upon boxes of small arms, artillery shells, radios, boots, rations, everything a modern army required to fight and survive on the hellish Eastern Front. These were not just goods, they were lifelines. Lifelines forged in Detroit, Glasgow, and Montreal, shipped across oceans, and entrusted to the waves, the ice, and the sailors. The cargo was bound for a Soviet Union locked in a brutal, grinding, and elemental war of attrition with Nazi Germany. From the snows of Leningrad to the steppes of Ukraine, Red Army troops were desperately holding the line, bleeding daily in the hundreds of thousands. Every tank that rolled off a landing dock, every shell that was unloaded onto a frozen Soviet pier, had the potential to tip the scale, even if only slightly, in battles that would echo through history. Operation Barbarossa had brought the full weight of Hitler's Wehrmacht crashing down on the USSR, and without these convoys, the Soviets might not have lasted the winter. But the route was more than just dangerous. It was hunted. The Arctic was no sanctuary. It was a theater of war where nature was as deadly as the enemy. The convoys sailed through unrelenting darkness in the winter months, with little hope of spotting threats until it was too late. Icebergs drifted silently like sentinels. Stiff gales created massive swells that slammed into hulls with brutal force. Visibility was measured in meters. Temperatures plummeted below -30 degrees Celsius. Steel cracked. Flesh froze. Equipment failed. And above it all, a dread specter loomed. Somewhere out there, beyond the rim of radar range, lurking in the ink-black void of snow and sea, was Scharnhorst, a predator of steel and fire. The sleek, menacing crown jewel of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet. Fast, well-armored, and bristling with guns, she was a warship built to chase and kill. In peacetime, she might have been a marvel of naval engineering, a triumph of German industry. But in the Arctic, she was a nightmare, a hunter in a sea of prey. Her very presence turned routine sailings into a deadly game of cat and mouse. With a top speed over 30 knots, she could outrun or catch nearly any Allied ship afloat. Her main guns, 9 11-inch monsters, could engage from beyond the horizon. Her armor made her impervious to anything short of a full-scale naval engagement, and she was not alone. German U-boats prowled these waters in deadly wolf packs, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes occasionally broke through the fog to scout convoys from above. But Scharnhorst was different. She embodied a level of threat that few in the Merchant Marine or Royal Navy could ignore. She wasn't silent like a submarine or fleeting like a bomber. She was tangible, massive, fearsome. She had sunk ships before. She would do so again, unless stopped. The very thought of her presence rippled across the convoys like electricity. Convoy JW 55B knew she was out there, possibly steaming at flank speed from the fjords of Norway, guided by German intelligence and driven by orders to shatter this Arctic supply chain. Her last known position was uncertain, but her likely path placed her directly in the convoy's shadow. Somewhere behind the blowing snow, somewhere beyond the black horizon, she moved through the storm like a shark, cold, silent, and deadly. To counter her, the Royal Navy had deployed some of its finest. The cruisers HMS Belfast, HMS Sheffield, and HMS Norfolk formed the core of the escort group, equipped with the latest radar systems and bristling with firepower. They were tasked not just with protecting the merchantmen, but with intercepting and, if need be, engaging Scharnhorst herself. It was a dangerous assignment. Scharnhorst outgunned each of them individually and could, in theory, pick them off one by one in open combat. But the British had a plan, and an ace in the hole. Vice Admiral Bruce Fraser's Battleship Duke of York, waiting further south with a strike force poised for the kill. In the stillness before the storm, tension crackled like static. On board every vessel, from the hulking cargo ships laboring through the waves to the sleek Royal Navy warships on station, men scanned the horizon, adjusted fire controls, checked depth charges, and watched their radar screens with silent intensity. Every flicker, every anomaly was a potential contact. Every signal could be the beginning of an attack. They knew the stakes. They knew what Scharnhorst had done before, raiding merchant shipping, bombarding coastal targets, slipping through patrol lines like a ghost, and vanishing back into the fjords. She had escaped British traps before. If she caught the convoy, there would be little hope for the slow-moving merchantmen. And if she escaped again, she would strike another day. So they waited, silent, focused, ready. In the heart of that Arctic night, amid snow squalls and freezing spray, Allied steel prepared to clash with Axis steel. The convoy crept forward, the Royal Navy's trap closing inch by inch, and the pride of the German Navy moved closer to her fate. Somewhere beyond the black waves, the hunter approached. The Scharnhorst had become a legend, an iron ghost that haunted the war-torn oceans of the Second World War. For years, she had danced on the edge of destruction, daring fate and defying the Royal Navy at every turn. She was more than just a battleship. She was a symbol of Nazi resolve on the high seas, a predator born of steel and ambition. Her sleek hull and powerful turbines allowed her to outrun many of her enemies, while her main battery of 9 11-inch 28 cm guns could shred anything short of a battleship into twisted wreckage. Her armor was thick, her crew seasoned, her captains bold. She had survived minefields, bomber raids, and torpedo attacks, time and again slipping the noose when the Allies thought they had her cornered. Together with her sister ship Gneisenau, Scharnhorst had once struck terror across the Atlantic and beyond. The two warships had earned their reputation early in the war, raiding Allied shipping lanes and crippling convoys with ruthless efficiency. In Operation Berlin, they had slipped undetected into the Atlantic and wreaked havoc, sinking over 100,000 tons of merchant shipping. Even more infamously, the pair had taken part in the audacious Channel Dash, racing through the heavily defended English Channel in broad daylight, past stunned British forces and returning safely to German ports. That operation in 1942 had humiliated the Royal Navy and thrilled the Nazi High Command. The Scharnhorst had become not just a weapon of war, but a talisman of German naval audacity. But by late 1943, the tide of war had shifted dramatically. The German Kriegsmarine, once feared for its surface raiders and Wolfpack submarines, was being squeezed on all sides. The Allies had grown stronger, smarter, more technologically advanced. Radar now pierced the darkness that once shielded German warships. Long-range patrol aircraft prowled the oceans relentlessly. Allied codebreakers had unraveled many of the secrets once hidden in the encrypted chatter of the German Navy. And still, the Arctic convoys kept coming, slow, vulnerable, yet unbroken. The convoys were a lifeline to the Soviet Union, ferrying tanks, guns, aircraft, ammunition, and food through some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. The Allied commitment to sustaining the Eastern Front through thick fog, freezing temperatures, and ever-present enemy threat had become unshakable. Each successful convoy not only strengthened Stalin's armies, but symbolized the unity and resolve of the Grand Alliance. For Hitler and the German High Command, this was intolerable. In the final days of 1943, the Germans made a desperate decision. The Scharnhorst, long confined to Norwegian fjords by a combination of fuel shortages, strategic caution, and Allied surveillance, would sail once more. She would lead a last-ditch offensive, a strike intended to cripple the Allied effort in the Arctic and restore German prestige on the seas. Her target, Convoy JW 55B, an assemblage of 19 merchant ships carrying vital war materiel to the USSR, escorted by a powerful screen of Royal Navy warships. This was no ordinary sortie. It was a high-risk gamble with everything on the line. The German plan was built around surprise and speed. Scharnhorst would break out from her anchorage at Altafjord under the cover of Arctic night and race northward to intercept the convoy. Her movements would be shielded by darkness, aided by Luftwaffe reconnaissance, and coordinated by German Naval Command in Norway. Once she had sunk the convoy or scattered it, she was to flee, back to the safety of the fjords before the British could react. But the Kriegsmarine faced a grim reality. Their once mighty surface fleet had been reduced to a handful of major ships. The Bismarck was at the bottom of the Atlantic. The Tirpitz, Scharnhorst's formidable half-sister, was disabled and under constant threat of Allied air attack. The Gneisenau was out of commission. The Prinz Eugen and other cruisers were tied up or assigned elsewhere. Only Scharnhorst remained as a fully operational capital ship, and even she was vulnerable. Her last upgrades had failed to fully modernize her radar suite, and she lacked a radar warning system to detect enemy emissions. She was powerful, yes, but not invincible. Still, the Germans believed the risk was worth it. If Scharnhorst could destroy JW-55B, the shockwave would be felt across 2 continents. The Arctic convoys might be suspended. Soviet morale could be damaged. Allied naval strength would appear vulnerable, and the Scharnhorst herself would reclaim her mythic stature as the scourge of the seas. So the order came down, cold and clear. Scharnhorst was to sail. On Christmas Eve, 1943, as most of Europe endured its 5th winter of war, the crew of Scharnhorst made final preparations. Below decks, sailors checked machinery, loaded ammunition, and ran drills. Officers pored over charts. The captain, Conter-Admiral Eric Bay, weighed the odds and plotted a daring course. The ship's boilers thundered to life, belching smoke into the Arctic sky. Her silhouette, painted in disruptive camouflage, blended into the icy darkness as she crept out of port with 5 destroyers in escort. Unbeknownst to the Germans, however, the British were already watching. Thanks to radio intercepts and signals intelligence, especially from the now legendary Bletchley Park, British Naval Command had foreseen the possibility of a German breakout. They had already positioned their forces accordingly. Rear Admiral Robert Burnett's cruiser force shadowed the convoy to the north, while Admiral Bruce Fraser's mighty battleship Duke of York, accompanied by additional cruisers and destroyers, waited in the south to pounce if Scharnhorst took the bait. The stage was set. What followed, over the next 24 hours, would become one of the most brutal, bitterly fought naval engagements of the Second World War. The Scharnhorst, apex predator of the Kriegsmarine, veteran of countless raids, survivor of 100 brushes with death, was about to meet her fate in the frigid waters of the Barents Sea. The Allies had laid the trap. The Scharnhorst had taken the bait. And on December 26, 1943, steel would clash with steel in a desperate all-or-nothing fight. History would remember it as the Battle of North Cape.